This is all theater. This is all just political theater.
Political theater. Political theater.
Pure political
theater.
Theater.
Political theater.
The
nefarious,
significant and protracted
political theater for political theater's sake.
I yield back.
From Washington, this is Political Theater, Roll Call's review of the spectacle of politics on Capitol Hill and across the country. I'm Jason Dick. Back in March, Alabama, Arkansas, California, North Carolina, and Texas held their congressional primaries, kicking off a mini-epoch of intra-party contests, mostly with some exceptions. We'll get to those. That has just now concluded with Tuesday's primaries in New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Delaware. Sort of. Thanks, Louisiana. So what's it all about? What can we learn from this past 6 months that has less to do with Donald Trump and Kamala Harris? Nathan Gonzales helps us with the big sort here. Nathan, welcome back to Political Theater. It's been low a few weeks since you've been on, but I think this is a great time to have you on to talk about congressional primaries. The debate between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris was last night, and I think everybody else is going to talk about this. Let's talk about.
Let's ignore it. It wasn't really that big of a story anyway. So we'll move on.
And today is that when we're recording this is 9/11. We're just going to breeze past that too and get right to congressional primaries, because this is, these sort of stories do tend to get subsumed, by the bigger stories, and obviously it is a big story. The debate between Trump and Harris. It was, you've written a column that's up on Roll Call now. People should go check it out. Our own John Bennett has written about it. We have factcheck.org's, take on it. We have done, I think, our due diligence, but very few people, I think, really dig into this. And we're going to talk about Tuesday's primaries, but I want to start at the beginning. Lo and behold, with 6 months of primaries, it has been a bit of a bit of a trip. Just the fact that on March 5th, the first congressional primary, both Texas and California, the two largest states, held their primaries, and then North Carolina, Alabama, and Arkansas. That it was just this big trove that we kicked off. A little bit of lulls here and there, obviously, over the summer, but let's talk about how many truly competitive primaries there were, both in do you want to start with the House or the Senate?
Well, I want to start even with the calendar that you laid out that we had 6 plus months that it took to finish these primaries, which, this is because the states are implementing elections. They can set their own calendar, but it's just remarkable to me that we've had nominees in key races for 6 months in some states, and we just got nominees in some states yesterday or last night. And, if I'm going to turn this into a New Hampshire hating podcast, New Hampshire needs to figure out if it wants to be first or last. It complains all the time, wants to be first in the presidential race, but they're last in the last batch of congressional races. So what is it, New Hampshire? Do you want to be first or do you want to be last? Because
maybe they want to play
very late in the game.
Like good politicians, they want to do it both ways. Or maybe they're like religious. The first shall be last and the last shall be first. That goes for Delaware too, the first state and the last to do a congressional primary.
Because when people think of religiosity, they definitely think about New Hampshire and Vermont as
Delaware,
the top places to go. All right, so how many competitive primaries? I think you said truly competitive. Well, what's the definition of truly? I would put it at somewhere north of 100. We're competitive, but we say, well, out of a universe of more than 900, right? Because you have 435 House districts, 2 parties of each. You have 33 Senate races, so and 2 parties in each of those. So opportunity for more than 900, but I would say truly competitive, north of 100, south of 200. Would be, we could describe as competitive.
Yeah, and I think that what that shows us too is that the path to Congress once you get past the primary is kind of set. That a lot of these primaries are determining, not just that there isn't much of a contest within, Democrats or Republicans, but also that because of the way congressional districts are drawn, I mean, there just aren't that many even general election seats. So we have out of 900 or so, primaries, we've got it to about 100 or so. And again, a lot of those were ones that we thought were competitive, that people thought, that maybe the candidates too thought they would be competitive, and they didn't turn out to be like so close in the end. But then how many of those, once the person won the primary, basically they're on a track to be in Congress because they don't.
We've been keeping a tally, and on our list at Inside Elections, which we publish a table, we'll publish a table in our next issue. We have 42 House members, 42 candidates that we call likely new members of the next Congress. So they won either a Democratic primary in a Democratic district or a Republican primary in a Republican district that isn't considered competitive in the general election, that we don't have it rated anything different than solid or likely takeover. And so 42 members, in 42 districts, the race is over. I mean, open seats that are over. And so I think that is a reminder that primary turnout is usually pretty abysmal, and that is a lot of voters are missing an opportunity to effectively choose the next member of Congress by not participating in the primary. On the Senate side, there are 6 senators who won where the primary was the most important election in that state, and the general election is just more of a formality. So, add those up to, it's big math here. 48 members of the next Congress are already basically decided, and we're still a little less than 2 months from the general election.
And that also, doesn't even take into account that a lot of contested general election races are almost over too, because of the nature of a Democrat running against a Republican running against a Democrat in a favorable, demographics or favorable voter registration rolls. And while there are 2 candidates, and there will be a race, and there will be a lot of money spent and a lot of airtime reserved and so forth, these races are not especially competitive either.
We're watching a universe of about 70 House races competitive in the general election, and we're probably being a little bit generous. Talking to some strategists, they on either side, they probably pin it closer to 50-ish. Our list is closer to 70. But and this often gets pinned on redistricting. Redistricting is a key part of this, but I believe that just saying, well, we need more competitive districts isn't necessarily it's not as simple as what it sounds, because another criticism of redistricting is that you can't divide up communities or communities of interest. Why are you dividing up this city but in my mind, in order to have more competitive districts from a partisan perspective, you probably need to divide a city that is more Democratic, include it with some suburbs that are more mixed, and include it with some rural areas that are more Republican in order to get some of that partisan balance. So I don't care what the districts look like. We'll evaluate them based on how they're drawn, but just saying, well, we need a more competitive but they also need to look neat and clean and tight. Those two things sometimes are not. Those are two different goals in this process.
Right. Yeah. And, you see this play out in places like Ohio, for instance, where, again, they're under sort of their own redistricting drama, where the Supreme Court kept on striking down, the state Supreme Court kept on saying, nope, you need to redraw these, and kept on blowing past deadlines. But there is this, phenomena where a lot of the cities are kind of intact, but the cities have such a density to them that you'll have a Democratic district, for instance, where there's more than 760,000 residents in that district, and then a more rural, kind of cohesive, community Republican district will have closer to 600,000, fewer people. So the Republicans have had an advantage there because their districts have been more cohesive, but they've been fewer people in them, and the Democrats have been sort of crammed into cities, but they're not breaking up, say, Columbus, for instance.
Right. When we're talking about, often the natural progression is talking about the lack of competitive districts in primaries producing ideological members that then come to Capitol Hill and just want to throw a wrench into things and be provocative. I would be, instead of attacking it as a redistricting issue, I wonder if there was more of a focus on that turnout issue that I was talking before. If we had more people participating in primaries, those people are probably going to be less ideological than the typical primary voter. And so maybe we would have different results from these primaries, different types of members with a different tone from the 42 races that we were watching. That were the primary effectively elected the next member of Congress. I don't know. We don't know. We don't know exactly how it turned out, but let's try to get more people to vote in primaries.
Right, and I think that the dynamic plays out in when you see policies that are very popular with the general population, like some kind of gun registration laws, for instance, are very popular. Abortion rights are very popular. If you look at the breakdown of Congress, they're among the most divisive issues around, but it's not reflective of the general population's attitudes. And I think it gets right to what you're saying, which is that, like at a political convention, you're seeing the hardest core of the hardcore of the party, And if you're talking about like somebody turning out in early April to a stand-up voting booth, like you may be not getting a representative sample. Our crosstown colleague Dave Wasserman did a Q&A with the New Yorker where he was talking about the Washington primary system, and this is an all primary top two advance to the general election primary, and all is also defined by the fact that it's an all male or mail-in voting, not all men.
That would create some waves, I think.
Very 19th century, thing. No, all mail-in voting. Yeah, mail-in voting. And the ballots are sent. They're mailed to every registered voter in the state, and so it's you get a different turnout and you get a different result from the fact that everybody's in the same primary, and the top two, whether they're two Republicans or two Democrats or two Greens or two independents or whatever, advance to the general election. And I wonder if that is more representative, because we're starting to see more states take a flyer on some of these, whether it's California does the same top two. Alaska does ranked choice. Maine does ranked choice. I mean, there seems to be a desire among some states to be like, maybe this Republicans over here, Democrats over here primary thing is not really working out that well.
Yeah, and before we talk about that, the all mail thing reminds me of when I worked at CNN. CNN.com was my first job out of college, and I was working for a woman named Karen Dessauer, who was powerful and influential within CNN.com at the time. We were talking about Oregon, and I talked to her and I mentioned the all mail voting, and the look on her face was like, what? In terms of she would not have been in favor of all MALE voting. So yeah, Washington is interesting. Well, those different types of primary, the non-traditional primaries, I think have helped a couple more moderate incumbents survive. I mean, I'm thinking about Lisa Murkowski in Alaska. If she had to face a traditional primary, she probably would have lost. But she was able to,
and like she did a few years ago.
Right? Yeah, I guess that's She would have been gone. She would have been gone by now. In Washington State, Republican Congressman Dan Newhouse continues to be in an extremely vulnerable position, but he was saved by the all-party primary 2 years ago, where basically he received, I want to say, less than 30% of the vote. A host of other Republican candidates received almost 50% of the vote. This cycle, his percentage went down even further in the all-party primary, but he still finished in the top two. But now he faces another Republican. I think it's going to be a challenge for him to continue on. But he would have been, my point is, in a traditional primary, he would have been gone. He would have been gone by now. And so that is.
And again, we should just note the underlying factor that it's not that Dan Newhouse is some sparkly moderate that appeals to people. It's that he voted to impeach Donald Trump. And so,
Correct.
which, in a Republican primary is like drinking hemlock. But again, I mean, he represents a conservative part of the state, in Central Valley and Yakima and so forth. But it's the general election could be a little different. I mean, who knows? He has a chance to survive as an incumbent that, as you said, he wouldn't have if he would have just lost the primary in a normal situation.
Yeah, and when we're talking about other states moving to this process,
I say normal. I apologize. I don't normal, traditional, whatever it is. I mean, I don't mean to put my finger on the scale of the primaries that we have typically covered for the last 25 years of our professional lives. So.
Yeah, and when we're talking about states moving to this process, changing their maybe traditional primary process to something different, it can be challenging because when you're talking about changing the rules of the game, one party will think that it's not in their advantage to do it. I mean, Republicans are very frustrated with ranked choice in Maine because they believe that's the only reason why Congressman Jared Golden has been able to win and survive. And so it depends on the state and a party's hold on the state because it's again, one party is going to feel like, why are we going to change the rules to help the other side? We'll just keep it as it is.
Right. So in the course of about 6 months, I mean, you and your deputy Jacob Rabashkin, I mean, you change your ratings, over the course, depending on polling, depending on money raised, depending on candidate quality, results of primaries and so forth. How many big shifts did you have to make that surprised you, took place this year within the course of the primary season from March to yesterday?
Yeah, not many is the short answer. There have been not. We'll start with the Senate. I went back. I believe we've made 3 Senate changes since. Actually, I think it's 4 since February, March. Arizona, moving Arizona in May, we moved that Senate race from toss-up to tilting Democratic. In February, we moved Michigan, the open seat, to a more competitive category. We moved Maryland onto the list when former Republican Governor Larry Hogan jumped into the race. I don't have on here West Virginia, West Virginia has been in a takeover category, but we had shifted it into even more of a takeover category. Actually, that was probably before the timeline that you laid out, because when Manchin ultimately decided not to run for re-election. So there has not been seismic changes in the House. I look back, it looks like we've made about 25 changes in House races over this year. And and 25 sounds like a lot more compared to the Senate, but compared to the totality of 435 districts in the House, that is not a lot. And I'm trying to think if I don't think there has been a primary where immediately after the result, that the result was so consequential that it fundamentally changed the outlook of the race, where we dramatically changed the rating. I'll probably get fact checked in the comments or the feedback or email, which is fine. We love viewer.
Not even Maryland, like with Hogan and Alsobrooks.
Well, I mean, we changed. We didn't change. You mean Alsobrooks with Dave Trone in the Democratic primary,
right? Yeah, like after Angela Alsobrooks beat David Trone.
No, we didn't. I don't think that was a game. I don't think that was a game-changing primary result. We can talk about. I think there were some interesting aspects of that primary that are some lessons that we can take away from it. But it was just going to be a different type of race depending on whether Hogan faced Trone or Alsobrooks. It was it's still going to be
competitive on the margins of being competitive.
Yeah. So. And maybe some of these, one of the striking things about this primary season is almost the lack of primaries, that both parties have come to the conclusion that you should try to avoid primaries at all costs. And I'm not really a firm believer that that's necessarily good. I think competitive primaries can be a proving ground for candidates, force them to raise money, get their sea legs as a candidate and as a campaign. until they get to a general election where everything is just more intense, more scrutiny, and they have to be, running at 100 plus miles an hour the whole time. So there is some risk by not having competitive primaries. Sure, they're able to save money, but are their candidates ready to perform in a general election if they need to be? I'll give a good example of where I think primaries can kind of help. Let's go all the way back to 2008 in the primary between Obama and Clinton. That extended primary, I think, helped Obama in the general election compete in states such as Indiana and North Carolina, where you previously in the primary had two well-funded campaigns registering voters, trying to get voters out. And then he was able to build on that primary process in order to do better in the general election.
You just reminded me that, North Carolina still a competitive, state at the presidential level, this year in particular. But isn't it amazing to remind yourself that Barack Obama won Indiana in 2008?
Yeah, it's a pretty big victory. And my Oregon bias always shows through. We'll go all the way back to 2000. In 2000, Oregon and New Mexico, I think, were two of the closest states. And now we really don't talk about those states in that way.
Yeah. And also, whenever, and I realize this is a tangent into presidential land. We'll get back to the primaries in a second, but whenever people say like, oh, this is just baked in, and this state is off the board forever, it's lost to Democrats or it's lost to Republicans. It's like Obama won Ohio and Iowa and Florida twice.
Right.
None of which are competitive in this presidential season. California produced Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. It's just things never really change until they just change all of a sudden, right? Which kind of gets back to a previous podcast last week that I did with Amanda Becker, who she was talking about her book about the Dobbs decision, the 1 year from the Dobbs decision, and she says, when you're in the middle of a political realignment, very few people say like, hey, we're in the middle of a political realignment. It only becomes obvious after a bunch of people have lost or a bunch of people have won.
Yeah. And Florida is a good example now, where Florida, in part because of the 2022 results being so overwhelmingly Republican, we have forgotten that in 2020, it was still pretty close. Biden came within a few points, within a handful of points of Trump. And so now when we're seeing some initial data post-reset to Harris at the top of the ticket that Florida could be competitive again, it can look surprising when it's like, oh, wait, Florida under most normal circumstances is still competitive. It's just 2022 made us think that it was on a quick glide away from Democrats for the near future.
And also, there's a lot going on there with, just where do you invest, right? Because maybe she's within 5 points of Trump in Florida, but it is so expensive to invest there. And if you don't need it as a state, but you really need Pennsylvania, she can lose Florida and still win the presidency. If she loses Pennsylvania, it's very difficult to see her path, to the presidency. And but on the other hand, if you give him a scare and think that he's going to lose Florida, he really doesn't want to lose his home state now. I don't know. It's again, sorry to divert too much into the presidential stuff.
I brought up 2008, so I was
you brought up 2000,
partially responsible. 2000, yes. Let's keep going.
Oregon and New Mexico.
You brought up Nixon, so I have to one up you on going backward.
I'm going all the way back to John Quincy Adams now. No, just kidding. So I'm curious too, like what, it seems like the what you're saying and is what is bearing out too is that the states that we were pretty sure were going to be competitive and the key to the majorities in the Senate and in the House are still those states. The House majority likely, if you look at where races are headed in New York and California, in suburban New York, Hudson County, like that area, and Long Island, and you look at Los Angeles, north of Los Angeles, and a little south and east in Orange County, like we knew that those were going to be important 2 years ago. They're still important, and everything else is kind of like there have been some surprises, but that's kind of locked in. And with the Senate, it's Ohio, Montana, Arizona. I mean, and
Michigan, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Wisconsin, Maryland, but the core of the battle, the core of the battlefield hasn't changed. What has changed over the last few months is the presidential race. And when you looked, pre-June 27th debate, pre-July 21st Biden dropping out, you looked at the core of the battleground, and Republicans were doing very well. Trump was doing very well, and that was helping Republicans down the ballot at both the Senate and the House level. When there was the reset to Harris at the top on the Democratic side, now she is getting back to close to the 2020 Biden performance, which it's still the Senate map is still a challenge for Democrats, but it keeps Democrats in the game in the House. That if she can run, fairly strong at the top of the ticket, that allows Democrats to have more of a, head-to-head fight slog against Republicans in enough districts to try to win the 4 seats that they need for the majority.
Yeah, and it seems that we are still regardless of whether the Republicans hold the House or Democrats take it over, it doesn't seem like we're in any kind of landslide one way or the other situation where people were talking about that, especially after the debate between Biden and Trump, where it's hard to overstate how the Democratic panic that was going on. And now what we're talking about is, regardless of who holds the majority, it'll be about a 5 to 10 seat margin.
Yeah, that's what Democrats need a net gain of 4 in the House. Our current range is anything from a Democratic gain of 5 seats to a Republican gain of 5 seats. But post-debate, I know we almost promised not to talk about the debate. We'll see what the state of the presidential race is. And if the presidential race starts to look better in one way or another for one party, then we have to start looking more specifically at the House, at its impact on House races. Because for those of you, you're not completely normal because you're listening to this podcast, but you probably know that there has been a trend of a lack of ticket splitting. In 2020, only 16 House districts voted for one party for president and the other party for the House. So that's why, in my mind, the top of the ticket matters. And
what I think is going to be very interesting too is in these, particularly in swing states on one hand. I mean, if Harris continues to be competitive in Georgia and North Carolina and even win those states, maybe it helps Josh Stein, who's running for governor of North Carolina, but the House, that deal is kind of sealed because of the way the districts are drawn.
Yeah, three of them are gone, but there's still the first district with Congressman Democrat Don Davis against Republican Lori Buckhout. That's still one of our 12 toss-up races, so it still matters. And if every seat matters, then right, just that her performance in North Carolina's first could be it's important.
Yeah, and then my home state of Arizona, I think the districts are drawn by an independent redistricting commission, so they're susceptible to wave elections, but they're remarkably stable. They're particularly the districts that are sort of drawn up as more competitive, and so we've got a couple of Republicans who are on the bubble, and depending on if Harris does well in Arizona, if Ruben Gallego beats Kerry Lake in the Senate race, that could have an effect on possibly 2 seats there. David Schweikert, who's in Phoenix area, and then Juan Ciscomani, who's in the second district, right? Second district,
6th district.
6th district. Sorry,
first, Schweikert in the first, Ciscomani in the 6th.
Yeah, they changed the numbers, I think, at one point, or
just to mess with us. Yeah. Just to mess with us. That's why they do it.
And he's more in the central, southern, and southeastern part of the state, Casa Grande, Tucson, places like that. And that's about turnout, right? I mean, there's a bunch of new voters in Arizona. There are every couple of years because people like moving there. Although with 100-degree day after 100-degree day for more than half of the year now at this point, maybe not as many people will be moving there as much. But then you get to California and New York again, where these are not swing states. Harris will likely win New York and likely win California. She may she may lose a little bit of ground, depending on, how it turns out. I mean, maybe she won't win by 30 points, in each one of those. But that, I don't know, I'm kind of fascinated because there could be ticket splitting, right? I mean, that's what we're seeing with like Mike Lawler's district, right, in Westchester and Dutchess County, in Hudson River Valley. I mean, that, Harris is going to win probably that district, and Harris is going to win that state, and Lawler is doing pretty well and is on track to win re-election.
Yeah, and there will be some ticket splitting. Lawler is a good example. We had that race in toss-up, New York 17th for a long time. We recently moved it into tilt Republican, which is in favor of Lawler because he has a good district-wide name ID. It's strong in terms of his favorability rating. Mondaire Jones, the Democrat, has some challenges, including not even being on the Working Families party line. He doesn't have that line, which in New York is it's problematic for him when you need to have almost everything go well in order to defeat an incumbent. But there will be some ticket splitting, and we point to what I would call the exceptions rather than the rule, or the aberrations rather than the trend. So when you look across a broad scope, hundreds of races in districts and states will align. The party voters vote for the same party. But yes, there will be a few instances of ticket splitting. That's not the norm.
And they may determine the majority in the House of Representatives.
Sure.
And the Senate.
Yeah. And people, there's ticket splitting. Look at Susan Collins. Like, yes, there was. That was the one state for president and Senate, but that's not. You're ignoring, not you, Jason, but everyone's ignoring. All the rest of them.
Yeah, I feel like this, we are kind of geeking out on this, but this, I think this is why I keep doing this. I mean, like it's a constantly evolving situation. It's never the same election. People can get frustrated by the lack of competitive districts, say, but we were talking about it the earlier part of this podcast, or, lack of turnout or whatever. But like the reality is it changes every single cycle. It's changing in the middle of cycles. And there just is always something weird going on.
It's very scientific. It's a very scientific turn. The game, the structure of the game remains the same, but there are always new players coming in and new locations, I guess, where we're playing the game in terms of the political environment that these races take place.
Let's return to talking, because I think this is going to be a little bit about Maryland. And again, we're close to Maryland, so it's kind of exciting to see a competitive race, particularly in a state that's, kind of overwhelmingly Democratic, at least at the federal level. But what's the primary race that told you kind of the most, the most interesting thing about this primary, that offered the biggest lesson, of all the primaries that we're following?
The Maryland Democratic Senate primary was more evidence of of where the Democratic Party is headed, right? You had Congressman David Trone, we'll just say a wealthy white guy, dumping in tens of millions of dollars and outspending his opponent, Angela Also Brooks, by, multiple times over, but she also Brooks happens to be an African-American woman, and she won the primary. I think that the Democratic desire to be led by candidates that are not just old white guys was evidenced in this primary, in which Trone again outspent Also Brooks by a huge margin. And then I think there is a connection to the energy, Jason, that you and I saw in Chicago at the United Center when Harris was taking over the reins of the party from Biden. And there is a palpable energy and excitement there, I think, because of who is now leading the party versus who was leading the party before. So that Maryland Senate primary seems like it was a long time in the past, but I think her profile and her resume, who she is as a person, talking about Also Brooks, overcame that financial disadvantage because of the appetite of the party.
And it was interesting. I mean, so and looking at their resumes too. Trone, he's a businessman. He's the head of is Total Wine, right? So I mean, he had all this liquor money. People like to drink. They like to fill his
particularly after this election, they will.
And he did. I mean, and he represents a part of Montgomery County, one side of like DC's wealthy Maryland suburbs. It's a very diverse county, but it is on the wider side. It's a little more competitive than some of the other Maryland districts, but in general, he had an easy time running and winning for his seat for Congress. Ozza Brooks, was a prosecutor, but also the Prince George's County executive. Prince George's County encompasses more than a couple of congressional districts. It's also I believe this is still the case, it is the wealthiest majority African American county in the country, and is sort of the other side of the Washington suburbs, if you will. And it's set up this just kind of fascinating event, campaign against, on one hand, Montgomery County, and on the other hand, Prince George's County. And I know it was bigger than that, but it was also like the white, older male, contingent of the Democratic Party, the younger Black female part of the party. And also, like, not for nothing, this will be, especially with Hogan winning the Republican nomination, this will be the first time in a long time that we will have a Maryland center that does not have Baltimore as their power base. The power base in Maryland Democratic politics is not in Baltimore anymore. Sorry, Baltimore, I love you. I love Baltimore, but it is DC, and DC sort of exurbs extended now.
Well, at least Baltimore will have the Orioles. The right. Orioles should be pretty good for quite some time. And then the other big surprise in the primary process overall was actually a primary that really didn't ever happen, and that was in the Indiana Senate race. Mm-hmm. Congressman Jim Banks, he actually ran for a leadership position, what seems like eons ago. He ran for the House Majority Whip, failed in that bid, and now has effectively landed in the U.S. Senate. But his ability to keep opponents from jumping into the race, an open U.S. Senate seat. These are some of the most coveted prizes in our electoral politics, and his ability to almost end the primary by fusing kind of the movement conservative wing of the party with the Trump wing of the party, and putting those two things together, and there not to be a primary at all for an open U.S. Senate seat was pretty remarkable. So and his journey and his path is remarkable because of where he thought he wanted to go. Being whip in the House. I mean, I guess God bless Tom Emmer, but that's a lot different job description than being in the U.S. Senate.
Yeah, just refer to the House floor today as the House Republican leadership tries to whip their members to support a short-term continuing resolution. It's being whip is not, I don't think, nearly as much fun as being senator.
I don't think
that's just one man's opinion.
I don't think Banks is sad about how this is played out.
Nathan, thank you, and thank you to Delaware and New Hampshire and Rhode Island for wrapping things up for this primary season. It really did last a long time. I always forget about these sort of September primaries because it seems like the convention, the national convention, our natural stopping point, and then it's like, oh wait, Massachusetts still. Oh wait, Delaware. But I know that these, in some ways these primaries weren't nearly as exciting as some in other parts of the country, but they're certainly exciting for the people who win. So it's nice to have a wrap on that. We did sneak in a little bit of debate talk, so we get that. And I look forward to the next. Was it 55 days, 54 days? Who's counting?
I don't know. We just take it one day at a time.
One day at a time. All right, Nathan. Thank you very much, and thank you out there for listening to us. Really, I mean, there's in the weeds, and then there's in the underbrush where we found ourselves in politics today. So if you're still listening, God bless you. Thank you so much, and we'll talk to you next time.